The Fallout video games are full of powerful enemies to threaten the player's survival, from genetically mutated monsters to heavily armed sentry bots and enemies with suits of powered armor that make them very resistant to most arms fire. Of course, it wouldn't be much fun if the games didn't occasionally give you the chance to wield incredible power against your opponents. There are a few weapons that will make you feel more like a death-dealing icon of power in the wasteland, like the M42 Fat Man, the game's shoulder-fired mini-nuclear launcher. Naturally, the name Fat Man is a reference to the Fat Man bomb that was dropped on Japan during World War II. In fact, the miserable post-apocalyptic atmosphere of Fallout is designed to drive home the idea that pre-war societies created the mess by becoming far too comfortable with the unchecked proliferation of dangerous technology. That the US military had been working on deployable shoulder-fired nuclear warheads is fun for gameplay purposes, but also a condemnation of the absurd nuclear proliferation leading up to the Great War in the Fallout universe. While the Fat Man itself is clearly a fictional weapon, it does seem to have come from a place of real-world inspiration. The most prominent piece of real-world weaponry from which inspiration was drawn is likely the Davy Crockett system. This consisted of an M388 projectile with an M54 warhead weighing just over 50 pounds, about the smallest practical warhead given the critical mass necessary to create a nuclear explosion. As a whole, the projectile weighed 76 pounds and has been described as resembling a watermelon with fins. The projectile was fired out of the M28 and M29 recoilless rifles. At just over 100 pounds, the smaller M28 had a maximum range of only 1¼ miles. The larger M29 could double this distance, but the assembly weighed over 300 pounds unloaded. The concept was to create a tactical nuclear weapon which would be less likely to lead to nuclear escalation, but which could still be powerful enough to stop an incoming Soviet attack. Although Fallout's Fat Man launcher is shoulder-fired, clearly these systems were far too heavy to be fired from the shoulder, and were instead designed to be fired from a fixed position and managed by a 3 to 5 man crew. Of interest, concept art for Fallout 3's Fat Man shows some interesting variations from what we see in the game today, including one design which is fired from a tripod. Whenever there is discussion about the Davy Crockett on the internet, I often see claims that the program was ultimately nixed because firing the warhead would be lethal to the team operating it. However, my research for writing this script has indicated this is not the case. Indeed, a live nuclear round was fired on July 17, 1962, with important representatives of the US government observing the launch. This threat did exist with the largest of the warheads, which were theoretically in the kiloton range, but the typical warhead for the Davy Crockett system was in the much lower range of 10 to 20 ton TNT equivalent. However, this doesn't mean the weapon system was without its issues. The projectile shape is really quite awful ballistically, and lacks the advantage of being fired out of a traditional barrel which would stabilize and direct it. Accuracy was noted to be quite poor, and operators had trouble hitting individual simulated targets such as vehicles. Naturally, accuracy issues and nuclear weapons are two concepts that don't play well with each other. In terms of effect on the battlefield, its most devastating effect was thought to be not its explosion, but its initial burst of radiation. The explosion would release a dose of radiation that would be lethal almost immediately within a range of 150 meters, and likely fatal in a very short time period within about 500 meters. For the stated purpose of fending off an invasion, especially one involving mobile and infantry units, this would seem to be quite effective. Beside the psychological impact and the deadly, if not entirely accurate, explosion, the radiation could instantly create an exclusion zone through which incoming forces could not advance. This is one area where there is some truth to the operators being at risk. Particularly heavy winds could spread unseen and deadly radiation in unintended directions. Development of the Davy Crockett system began in 1958 after design acceptance, and it's reported that 2,100 were actually produced. The weapon was deployed with the US military in the 60s, with noted inclusion in the West German area. There were even reportedly a couple sent to airborne artillery units attached to the 82nd Airborne, and these were capable of being airdropped into a strategic location. It's reported that the last of these units was pulled and deactivated sometime between 1968 and 1971. The US weren't the only ones interested in the power of the Davy Crockett launcher. West Germany's defense minister saw great utility in them and advocated that they could be used to bolster defenses against a Soviet invasion, with each unit replacing 40 to 50 traditional artillery units. Luckily, smarter heads prevailed, and it was pointed out that this would nearly guarantee the exchange of tactical nuclear weapons in the event of any war, and would lead to further escalation. Thankfully, these portable nuclear launchers were pulled from service with only a single live nuclear round fired during testing and never during a conflict. Now that we've discussed a portable mini nuke launcher, I'd like to get into one other weapon which is a clear inspiration for the Fat Man. Before I do that, I want to encourage you to leave a like if you're finding the video informative, and leave a comment with your favorite impressions. Or if you don't like it, feel free to leave a dislike and a mean comment. I'm a big boy now, I only cry for a little bit when people are mean to me on the internet. Anyways, I pointed out earlier that the Fat Man was a major departure from the Davy Crockett by way of being shoulder-fired instead of stationary. I think there's one more weapon that greatly influenced the design of the Fat Man. This time we have to go back a little further to the early years of World War II. Tanks and armored vehicles had been changing the battlefield since they hit the scene in a big way in World War I. Naturally, foot soldiers on the ground needed something to disable these tanks. At first, large-bore and high-velocity anti-tank rifles were used to pierce the armor and disable these vehicles or kill those inside. But by World War II, developments in armor had gotten to the point that anti-tank rifles were now only effective against lightly armored transport vehicles and other sensitive infrastructure. A new solution was needed. Luckily for the British, advances in explosives technology came just in time to create a solution. In the 1880s, American engineer Charles Monroe discovered that the effect of an explosive could be greatly enhanced if there was a hollow recess in the projectile which faced the target. In the 1930s, it was discovered that this effect could be further amplified by lining the recess with metal. This metal, at high velocity from the explosion, and being pushed by a great pressure wave, could effectively cut through armor. This was the start of the shaped charge as we know it. It wasn't long before this was incorporated into a handheld launching system. In August of 1942, production in England began on a new anti-tank weapon, the PIAT, Projector, Infantry, Anti-Tank. The PIAT in actuality was a spigot mortar on a shoulder-fired platform which could throw its 3-pound projectile a moderate distance. Although this would give foot soldiers some option when coming up against armor, there were still many problems with the system. Poor accuracy, limited range of little over 100 yards, severe recoil, crude sights, mechanical stoppages with the weapon, and fuses which failed to ignite rounds. It is remembered somewhat roughly today for these reasons, despite being an effective stopgap measure. Looking at the profile, it's easy to see how the PIAT and the Fat Man share similar design history. To start with, they are roughly the same size and weight, with the Fat Man weighing 30 pounds in Fallout 4 and the PIAT weighing roughly 32 pounds. It's clear that both feature stamped metal construction, and the trigger assembly and furniture bear obvious resemblance. Additionally, the two are reloaded much the same way and have very similar ballistic arcs and accuracy issues. The Fat Man must be fired high to compensate for notable drop, and it is difficult to hit a single-point target at any extended range. They even share similar firing mechanisms, although the PIAT uses a spigot with a heavy spring assembly to launch the projectile, while terminals at Fort Strong indicate that a subcaliber charge had to be added to extend the range of the Fat Man, because it would often explode too close to the operator and actually resulted in the deaths of 2 soldiers during testing in 2076. So there we have it. A Cold War tactical nuclear launcher meant to miniaturize the scale of nuclear conflict, and a World War II service weapon quickly built to press into service against a new threat. These two concepts capture Fallout's blend of sci-fi and retroistic inspiration, as well as its caution as a polemic against the escalationism of military conflicts. Thanks for sharing your time with me today to take a look at this subject. If you have something else you'd like to see covered, please feel free to leave it below. I have playlists on the Fallout video games as well as sci-fi weapons, both of which I'll link in the description for those interested. Until next time, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you.